So we're, as Darren said, we're up to on the home stretch, but 25% of the course is yet to be covered tonight. So just a quick recap. Weeks 1 and 2, we looked at different techniques, or week 1 really different techniques of writing the psalm, different poetry styles and so forth. And we've seen those in operation continuously. Week 2, the broader context for the compilation of the Psalter as we know it, and how it's in fact a book of books, compiling really, well, comprised of 5 books, which are the collections of the Psalms. And then last week we covered books 1, 2, and 3, which is basically Psalm 1 to 41, and then Psalm 42 to 72, and then Psalm 73 to 89. And today we will cover books 4 and 5 and basically just have a little summary. So I hope we'll have at least 5 minutes for questions. But anyway, I always make these promises and then the time runs out. So if you have a look, book 4 of the Psalter is Psalm 90 to Psalm 106 inclusive. And the inspiration behind it comes largely from the time of the exile. The time of the exile, as I've mentioned several times already, is from 587 BC to 538 BC. It's only 49 years, and but those 49 years are an absolute watershed for the people of Israel in their history. It's kind of just embedded on their psyche and profoundly impacted on them and their memory about their story and the covenantal relationship with God. The book 3, as we covered last week, the lead up was basically the divided kingdom. So, you know, when not only the son of Solomon ends up basically Rehoboam, and then the northern 11 tribes break off from the south and Judah, but also then the Assyrians in 722 come and absolutely obliterate the nation, and that was a disaster. So they, by the time their own exile of the southern kingdom came about in 587 BC, they would have just constantly lived in fear of the worst events actually coming to pass. And so what we see in now book 4 is just such a fear being realized. So this is the deepest, darkest period for the history of the people of Israel. And what does book 4 begin with? Well, before I start going into that, just have if you've got that table with all the superscriptions and the Gattungs's next to each other, the titles of the Psalms and then the style, just bring that up and have a look at numbers 90 to 106. You'll see how quite a few of them don't actually have a title. And I'm not sure exactly why that is, but they're not titled. They've certainly got a style, and a lot of them are enthronement. And the enthronement Psalms, but then there's also creation, which hasn't got a title, and a community hymn and a community lament. They're actually also very interesting. We'll get to those as we cover the end of book 4. But the central character of this theme is actually Moses. And out of the 150 Psalms, only 1 is dedicated to Moses. Just in the beginning 2 books, we had lots of Psalms dedicated to David. Then we hit book 3, no Psalms dedicated to David, but lots of other players came in. And then book 4, no Psalms dedicated to David. And then David makes a reappearance back in book 5, which we will get to. But this one, Moses, is the central character and God. So you might wonder why does Moses feature so highly in the time of exile? Well, the time of exile makes people that hit rock bottom, and when someone hits rock bottom, regardless whether in their religious experience or whatever experience in their life, if they've got any common sense about them and they haven't gone completely mad, they start taking stock of what led them there. So they hopefully get out of it and learn from the experience and move on. And so Moses in Psalm 90 comes to speak to them. And they're thinking, how did we get here? Oh, we have not been faithful to the covenant. That's why we are here. So Moses then takes them back to the time of Exodus and the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And we see how, what does Moses, those 40 years of the wilderness are covered by several showdown moments, but predominantly amongst them, it was a time when God gave Moses what? Press and hold down the space bar if to answer that question. What was the central biggest event of the Exodus experience, as in the not just coming out of Egypt, but those 40 years of wandering in the wilderness? What was it essentially all about? Just hold your space bar down.
10 Commandments.
The 10 Commandments, right? So, which is thank you, Rosina, which was essentially the summary of the 10 words, but of the law, the Torah. And the Torah, so it was not only receiving then the Torah, but also learning how to live by that Torah, that instruction. What happened did the people who left Egypt, did they enter the promised land? No. See several heads nodding. Why not? Because they were so cooperative with God's plans that they deserved such a great gift as promised to Abraham. No, it's they were stubborn. They were stubborn. They'd seen the 10 signs, the 10 judgments of God upon the false gods of Egypt, and still they didn't trust him. They defied him. And so when the initial group of spies, you might recall the spies, within a few months, they actually got to the promised land. And the spies went in to check it out. They came back, and 2, Caleb and Joshua, gave a good report. The other 10, unfortunately, gave a bad one. The majority ruled, and then God says, right, you're in the promised land for 40 days. You're going to wander in the wilderness 1 year per day. Ouch. So that's what was happening. And then he said, right, everyone over 20 will die in the wilderness, except for those other 2. So it was pretty, they think back to Moses then, because this is the time when Moses was teaching them how to follow the law of God. And that's essentially what Psalm 90 is about. And it's the background to the experience of this whole exile period, but also of this book in the psalter of the Psalms. So it's very strategically placed there. And it's a community lament. Also, before we actually get into Psalm 90, I want to mention that in the exile, now there was no kingdom, no David, no Solomon, no land. They were slaves. It really brings back very much their whole experience from their ancestors of Egypt, where they were enslaved for 430 years. In that time in Egypt, there was no king. In fact, all the way up to Saul, there was no king, because who was their king at that time, or up to Saul? Who was the king of the people of Israel?
God.
Sorry?
God.
Thank you, Rosina. God was their king. And so they're going to return back to that. But we'll see more of this a bit later on, that the failed kingship experiment that is going to be replaced. So if, Darren, you could bring up Psalm 90, verses 1 to 4. So we're going to see now how the Psalm 90 actually begins to look back, and Moses is speaking. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn us back to dust and say, turn back, you mortals. For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past, or like a watch in the night. You might think, well, how does this actually stack up with the exile experience? Well, it doesn't, but it's reflective of where the heart of the people in exile was going back to. It goes back to God as the eternal creator. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you formed the earth, God was there. You are everlasting to everlasting. In other words, you are the stable connection here in this whole episode, this whole major drama. You are the constant element. And you say to us, turn back, you mortals. Just as God had chosen us from the people, as the people of Israel, so too now you've abandoned us into this place of punishment in the exile. And also that the fact that 1,000 years in your sight are like a watch in the night, or like yesterday. So by the time they'd come out, Moses, it was 1250 BC, and Abraham was 1850 BC, and 587 BC was the Babylonian deportation. So it was over 1,000 years, and so the psalmist is thinking, okay, yeah, we've stuffed up, but God, you are the faithful ones. Psalm 89, though, the end of book 3, had finished with answering by asking the question, how long, O Lord, will you hide yourself forever? How long, O Lord, will you hide yourself forever? How long will your wrath burn like fire? Lord, where is your steadfast love of old, which by your faithfulness you swore to David? And then Psalm 90 is as if it's asking or offering the answer to that question. Because, how long, O Lord, will you hide yourself forever? The response from Psalm 90, 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday. So Psalm 90 verse 4. Or in Psalm 89, there's a lament, the broken covenant with David. But now you have spurned and rejected him. You are full of wrath against your anointed. You have renounced the covenant with your servant. You have defiled his crown in the dust. Why? Why has God announced the covenant? Psalm 90 responds or replies, for we are consumed by your anger. By your wrath we are overwhelmed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your countenance. Verses 7 and 8 there. So there's this, toing and froing there, responding to the end of the previous book. But what Psalm 90 is ultimately trying to do is that the grand experiment of kingship has failed. God was happy to be the king of the people of Israel. Saul, they wanted a king. He warns them against it. And they said, no, we still want a king. He's going to lord it over you. He's going to take from your children. He's going to take from your flocks. No, we still want a king. So now they're under the influence of their neighbors. And God had warned them when they went into the promised land, you are not to mix and mingle with these people, which is the Pharisees is something they took very, very seriously. You might be interested to note that the word Pharisee comes from a Hebrew verb, pharas, which means several meanings, but one of them means to set oneself apart. So they did set themselves apart from the non-Jews, and particularly those whom Jews, but they considered to be sinners. That's why they're so scandalized when they see Jesus eating and drinking with tax collectors and sinners. Jesus was doing what was forbidden to be done, i.e., to mingle with the nations, so to speak. And that was for a very good reason, because the Canaanite nations would corrupt basically the Israelites, and it had been shown to all and sundry that it took 40 years to turn the hearts of the Israelites wandering in the desert to learn to trust in God. And those hard advantages, hard lessons learned, were undone fairly quickly. But the kingship experiment had failed now. And in thinking of the time past, it was basically by going back to Moses. Okay, that was a good story in our history. God is the one who actually has sustained us. So we are alone now. There's no king. We don't have a land. We're essentially, well, not quite wandering. We're stable enough, but we are essentially under the care of God. You know what? For 40 years, God provided for us. For 40 years, the clothes didn't wear off our backs and sandals didn't wear off our feet. And how can we learn to live like this again? That's what Psalm 90 is essentially trying to learn and reflect. So it's actually quite a shocking time for those people reflecting their experience, because it's hard. It's one thing to say, oh yeah, just trust in God, but you don't know what trust really means or costs until you're actually doing it, until the other crutches that you spiritually hung on to are no longer there for you to lean on. We then move on to Psalms, a whole series of enthronement Psalms. And you might recall that the enthronement Psalms was one of the subcategories of creation, royal enthronement, and wisdom type Psalms. So Psalm 93 and then Psalms 95 to 99 are all enthronement Psalms. And you might think, well, where does it get this inspiration of placing God as enthroned amongst his people? Because there's no physical expression in the history of Israel where there's like some ceremonial enthronement of God. God is just there. God is the one taking all the initiative. The people sometimes respond positively and sometimes don't. Scholars disagree or differ with each other, sometimes disagree with regard to any particular event or episode that this might refer to very clearly. What I find more convincing is that episode from second book of Samuel, where we're told, David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of trumpet. This is from 2 Samuel chapter 6, verses 15 to 19. Maybe you want to bring that up, please, Darren.
Sorry, what was that one again, Mark?
2 Samuel chapter 6. I won't do this too often. Verses 15, that's it, 15 to 19.
Yep.
Okay. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the trumpet. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. They brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before the Lord. When David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the offerings of well-being, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts and distributed food among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, to each a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins. Then all the people went back to their homes. Before this episode took place, he was going to bring the ark over, and the oxen stumbled, and the sons of Hophni and sons of Eli, Hophni and the other guy, went to stabilize the ark, and as they touched it, they both dropped dead. And David was rather concerned that this is what happened to two of the priest's sons. What's going to happen to me if the ark comes to my place? Well, anyway, then the ark is taken temporarily to someone else's house. So David would rather somebody else get punished than risk have the curse coming upon himself. And the ark was there in safekeeping for 3 months. And the journey then eventually, after the 3 months, during that time, God had blessed that particular person. And David thought, oh, okay, maybe now's the time to bring the ark over. So this could be some kind of a historical context as an inspiration for these enthronement psalms. But eventually, you can see what's coming, that the tent over the Ark of the Covenant would eventually be transformed into a temple. And David has the idea of wanting to build a temple, but that doesn't happen. God won't let him because he's shed too much blood. And he says, your son will build me a temple. Also, the idea of the enthronement of God was taken very much from some of the ancient Mesopotamic myths. Like various other passages from the gospel, from the scriptures, Old Testament, New Testament, the Genesis, a lot of the myths that were floating around were often reworked, purified from their errors, and incorporated into the sacred experience of the people of Israel. So the enthronement of God also took as some inspiration, you might say a human inspiration, various other stories about the enthronement of gods from ancient Mesopotamia. But these, I won't go into the detailed story, it's a bit dry and boring, but just suffice to say, excuse me, that the enthronement of God idea isn't just something that the psalmist just clutched out of the ether. There's often other historical surroundings and backgrounds that lead to it in some way. And I think, okay, yeah, that's something that happens in our religious experience. Let's take that and rework it. We then come to Psalms towards the end of Book 4, which is comprised of Psalms 105 and Psalms 106. They're both community hymns or community psalms. One is a community hymn, 105, and then 106 is a community lament. So if you could bring up Psalm 105, please, Darren, verse 8. So we're just going to read through a bunch of verses, but I just want you to keep an eye out. This Psalm 105 and 106 are essentially a summary of the salvation history of the people of Israel. So if you want a brief summary of the history of the people of Israel, read Psalms 105 and 106. So verse 8, we start off with, he is mindful of his covenant forever, of the word that he commanded for 1,000 generations. So the faithfulness of God. Then we move to verse 14. Sorry, before that, go back a little bit, sorry. Verse 9, the covenant that he made with Abraham, his promise sworn to Isaac, which he confirmed to Jacob as a statute, to Israel as an everlasting covenant. We move then to verse 14. He allowed no one to oppress them, who rebuked kings on their account. Well, that's a reference. The first one was obviously a reference to calling Abraham to leave his home and his kinsmen and go to a land that he would show him. Now God has fulfilled his promise to Abraham, and he's given him Isaac. But now this Isaac is gone, Jacob and Esau. Out of Jacob, he has become a tribe, and this tribe has become a nation, really, in Egypt. And you see it there in verse 17. Darren's got highlighted. He has sent a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. You might remember the story of Joseph. He was didn't have a Technicolor Dreamcoat, but anyway, that's what Andrew Lloyd Webber did. But he certainly had a nice coat done by him, by his father Jacob, and it was brought on a lot of jealousy for his brothers. Then in verse 26, he sent his servant Moses and Aaron, whom he had chosen. Before we go further, when it said he disciplined kings before him, that is also, he rebuked kings on their account. That's a reference to the Amorite kings that Abraham took on to rescue his nephew Lot, and him and 318 men. And on their way back, Abraham paid tithes to this mysterious figure, Melchizedek. So anyway, but 26, yep. So we've got, obviously that's about the Exodus, Moses. Then 37, then he brought Israel out with silver and gold, and there was no one among their tribes who stumbled. The silver and gold is a reference to how they despoiled the Egyptians. Moses had given the instruction, ask for silver and gold from your neighbors, and God gave the people of Israel favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, and so they gave them all their gold and silver. So that's what that's about. And then verse 44, he gave them the lands of the nations, and they took possession of the wealth of the peoples. So that's after the period of the Exodus, and now they've inhabited the land of Canaan, which is the land promised to Abraham, and therefore God has kept his promises. Then we move to Psalm 106, and this is a lament, so it's a confession of Israel's sins, pretty obvious as a lament. Now, verses 6 and 7, for both we and our ancestors have sinned. We have committed iniquity, have done wickedly. Our ancestors, when they were in Egypt, did not consider your wonderful works. They did not remember the abundance of your steadfast love, but rebelled against the Most High at the Red Sea. There were several showdown moments in the history of the people of Israel, and obviously the golden calf was one of the, I think we're going to come across that one now, but there was a time where there was this constant rebelling, basically, that was going on. There was another time where this is I think in the book of Numbers, it's not so much in the Psalms, but where God made the people choose who is with me and who is for the Lord. And yeah, we got the earth opened and swallowed up Dathan, verse 17, and covered the faction or the clan of Abiram. And then we see in 19 to 20, yep, they made a calf at Horeb, worshipped a cast image. They exchanged the glory of God for the image of an ox that eats grass. Again, a recounting of their own history, but this is the bad side of it, right? Their infidelities. Then 34 to 35, They did not destroy, 34 to 35, they did not destroy the peoples as the Lord commanded them, but they mingled with the nations and learned to do as they did. They did not faras themselves. They were not Pharisee, so to speak, and they mingled with them, and then they were corrupted, just as God said would happen. And the final verse that again helps to bring this out is 45. For their sake he remembered his covenant and showed compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. So, although the people are unfaithful, God is always faithful. So there's a real, there's a real summary there of the history of salvation in Psalms 105 and 106. Then we finish book 4 in Psalm 106, verse 48, with the usual doxology. You might recall that books 2 and 3 finish with a doxology, a glory of God, and so does book 4. Book 1, you might remember, did not have a doxology at the end of it, because when book 1 and 2 were originally going to be conceived in the psalter as one block, and so that there's no kind of natural finish with the end of Psalm 41, the last verse of that. But it does repeat the very first verse of Psalm 1, verse 1, in that same big book. Okay, any questions so far? I know there's a lot to take in there, so I will write you these notes when my funerals stop coming in and sick calls stop taking up my time. But as you can imagine, these things have to take priority. But you will get some notes eventually with a lot of these details in them. And you can check them for yourselves as well. Okay, good. Well, let's go.
We've got about 20 minutes. 20 minutes left.
Okay, thank you, Darren.
Sorry, Anthony.
Question.
Yeah. What's the difference between the punishment of God and the natural consequence for sin, I suppose, going against God?
And basically, the big sin, good question, the big sin of the people of Israel is their forgetfulness of the covenant. God uses all sorts of imagery to describe their infidelity, comparing them to a harlot, comparing all sorts of marital imagery, but it's basically the forgetfulness. That's why I often say the biggest sin of the people of Israel was forgetfulness, because forgetfulness meant they stopped thinking about what God had done for them. Once they stop thinking, they start thinking about other things, and then things go from bad to worse. That's why in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verses 4 to 7, it's in fact the church places it on her own lips in the divine office, night prayer on Saturday night. And she says, and these words you must have on your lips and in your heart, and you must tell your son when you are waking up in the morning, and when you're going about your day, and when you're sitting down, and when you're lying down. Why? Because you've got to drill in them the story of what God has done. And if you do that, you'll be faithful, you'll be listening to the Torah, and you'll have the proper devotion of a good Jew, a good Israelite. If you don't do that, then you'll goof up. The fact that it had to be done continuously just shows the ordinary human tendency to forget, to get distracted. Now, your question about what's the difference between God's punishment and just the natural consequence. The natural consequence is God's punishment. That's the general way in which the Israelites interpret things. And that's why you find in some of the later books, particularly this is reflected in the Septuagint. So as they're translating from the Hebrew to the Greek, they're looking at the ways in which God's promises had been fulfilled, but different from what they had expected. So they've actually rewrote some of those books. But generally, yeah, it's through the interpretation of events, the natural consequences, and they then, through the eyes of faith, put the interpretation, this is God's punishment. So there's actually a lot to learn from that. That's a very good question, because in people's lives, our own lives, the consequences of our lives, God lets us, he gives us free will, and their choices have consequences, good and bad. And if we have obviously trust in him and pray for wisdom, we're more likely to get it right. But no one's infallible. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Book 5. Book 5 is really, the end, the conclusion is going to be a summary, basically, of everything that we've done. So I'll just spend now the rest of the time Book 5. Book 5 is a big chunk, right? So it's the biggest, in fact. It's Psalms 107 to 150. But there's some nice little blocks of Psalms that reflect the different aspects, again, of the Israelite history. If you've got the table that I sent you with you, just have a look at it, and the superscriptions, so the titles. The first Psalm, 107, has no title, and it's a community hymn. Then we got a Psalm of David, another Psalm, 3 Psalms of David, different, community lament, individual, royal. Then we've got from 111 to 119, no titles of the Psalms. And there's reasons for that, but they're all, as you can see on the right-hand column, community hymns, individual thanksgiving, and so forth. Then we begin a section, a big block, 120, Psalm 120 to Psalm 134, a song of ascents, and we'll talk about what this is and what that's dealing with. And then we have Psalms 135 to 37, again, a little hiatus, you might say, but they make a contribution. And then eventually we come to a few more Psalms of David until the last 5 Psalms, 146 to 150. They're another block again. So, what's the general inspiration or background for the book 5 of the Psalter, these 43 Psalms? And it's the post-exilic period. Some call it the Second Temple period. So from 538 BC until whatever, a century or so before Christ was born, the Psalms would have been written, and they reflect the lessons learned from the painful time of the exile, those 49 years, which seemed endless. Now, 49 years is, more than half a lifetime. And the people who went to exile in Babylon, those people died there, except for those who were very little. And only those who were very little would have lived through that whole time. And in their elderly years, remember at that time, to live 60 or 70 years meant you're pretty old. In fact, Psalm 90 says that. What are our years? 70. Our span is 70 years and 80 for those who are strong. And most of these are, suffering and so forth. They pass swiftly and we are gone. So it's the people who went to the exile, most of them did not come back. So the experience now of the post-exile period is lessons passed on from their parents. So their parents have learned the lesson: you be unfaithful to God, God will punish you, and this is what happened. And so they're pondering over this experience now. They've been allowed to come back to their own land, so which is more than they had before, so that that punishment has been lifted from them. But their expectation that the previous kingdom was going to be re-established, that doesn't happen. So they're pondering over this. What's going on? There was a time in the time of the Greeks where briefly the kingdom, you know, it's reflected in the book of the Maccabees, 1 and 2 Maccabees. The Jewish rule or autonomous rule was established, but they were hoping to have restoration of the kingdom of David and of Solomon, and that was never to be again. So now the idea of the failed kingship experiment, that is going on again. Now they're in their own land, but they're actually not totally free. They're under a foreign power, whether it's the Persian government or Persian Empire, the Seleucid, the Greeks, and then eventually the Romans, but someone else is in charge of us. And they've got to learn how to live within this situation, learn that God is their ruler and their provider, as he was before. So Psalm 107, can we bring that up, please, Darren? Verses 1 to 3. Why it's important and we need to look at this a bit is that it's the first of the book. So, oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so, those he redeemed from trouble and gathered in from the lands, from the east and from the west, from the north and from the south. That's what people who've come from a journey say. They've come from all over the place. He's regathered them into the land of Canaan. It's very clear there. In verse 47. Verse 47. Sorry.
No.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. In 106:47, we're told, you know, save us. So this is the end of the previous book. Save us, O Lord our God, and gather us from among the nations, that we may give thanks to your holy name and glory in your praise. So in Psalm 106, verse 47, it was the end of the exile period. They're making this prayer, and now God has fulfilled it in Psalm 107, because he has brought them back to their own land. But what we find also in Psalm 107 is two big blocks, verses 1 to 32, and then we find from 33 to 43. And many scholars think that these were probably two psalms originally, but they were somewhere along the line brought together. And why? Because they're written in a bit of a different style, and they emphasize certain different words as well. But what we find, excuse me, in Psalm 107, verses 4 to 32, so we won't read it all, we find that it deals with stories of 4 groups of people that the Lord has rescued from perilous circumstances, right? So this is the first psalm of the book that's reflecting the post-exile period. What are you going to think about when you just come back from an exile? Wow, we've dodged a bullet. Isn't God good to us? How has he rescued us? And these groups are the wanderers lost in the desert, prisoners, sick persons, and shipwrecked sailors. And each story follows a similar, like a sort of 4 themes: a description of the distress, a prayer to the Lord, details of the deliverance, and an expression of thanks. So these mark that first part of the book of Psalm 107, which is the first part of book 5. Then we move along. Psalms 108 to 109, 110 are Psalms of David. And again, they're not major contributions, but they certainly reflect another development. So David now makes his re-entry into this book after having been missing from the Psalms of books 3 and 4.
Got about 8 minutes till 8.
Great. Then we have in Psalms 111 and 112 2 acrostic psalms. Remember, the acrostic was one of the techniques that we covered in week 1. We had the parallelism, the mixed versions, we had acrostic, we had the chiastic structure, we had those. So there's an example there. Then we come up with Psalms 113 to 118. These are known as the Egyptian Hallel Psalms, 113 to 118. These were psalms that reflect the Passover. And in fact, these are prayed during the time of Passover. You know, in St. John's Gospel, when we're reading the Passion, and we're told, and then they sang psalms, and then they went into the Kidron Valley. They crossed the Kidron Valley to the Garden of Gethsemane. Well, these are the psalms that Jesus and his apostles would have sang, or some of them at least, at the Last Supper. So 113 to 118. Then Psalm 19 is the longest psalm. Psalm 19 has 176 verses. I often like to give the Psalms as a penance when penitents come to confession, but I haven't given 119 to anyone yet. So they haven't been that naughty. But but anyway, if you certainly want to do a bit of penance, I mean, it's a beautiful psalm. But it's an acrostic, so each of the letters, the 23 consonants of the Hebrew alphabet, is used, and 8 lines of text are dedicated to each letter. And so as we covered before, the acrostic is originally probably developed as a memory tool, but it's a way of showing the fullness of the alphabet, and in so doing, communicating the fullness of wisdom contained in the text of that psalm. So Psalm 119 is all about the Torah piety, the wisdom of the law of God, which is what Moses received in the wilderness. And then we have Psalms 120 to 134, which are the songs of ascents. And Psalm 119 is read at the Feast of Pentecost. And so the spring festival, 50 days, and the feast celebrates the giving of the Torah to Moses at Sinai during the wilderness wanderings. Again, in the Hebrew, no title given to it, but in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it's does have a title, classified as an Alleluia Psalm. Then Psalm 120 to 134, the songs of ascents, and these are psalms traditionally read at the Feast of Tabernacles. We don't have an equivalent of that in the Catholic calendar, or the Feast of Booths, which is in the autumn, so coincides with our spring, really. So the Feast of Tabernacle commemorates God's care for the Israelites during the time of the wilderness wanderings. So you see how 113 to 118 cover the Passover event, boom. And then the 119 covers the Torah, and then 120 to 134 covers the 40 years of that, how God provides. The I won't go into Psalm 133 is a little neat little study of how a psalm was compiled, but I will leave that included in the notes. Then 135 to 137, again, a few more psalms, and then we go towards the end of the book, which finishes basically with a bunch of doxologies or praising psalms. Book 5 does not end with a doxology. And some scholars have asked, well, why is that the case? Because the whole 5 psalms, the last 5 psalms of the Psalter, are all praising psalms. So they are as in every other book, you would have one verse praising God. So in the Psalms, the last 5 psalms, they are the whole 5 psalms are the praising of God, and thus form the proper ending for the book of the Psalter. What we find in a lot of the psalms, the last few psalms, not the praising ones, but 144, 145, is a movement from David to the generations of Israelites and then to all of creation. And again, I won't go into any more detail because we haven't got the time. So in the end, how should we look or read the book of the Psalter? To realize that it wasn't just compiled overnight, that it's a profound reflection of the people of Israel, drawn from often pre-existing material, but not always, and then refined again and again and again, sung in the communities, and as the people lived out their history, it was formulated with the different moments where you got the kingship of David in book 1, and then Solomon in David and Solomon book 2, the time of the divided kingdom book 3, the exile book 4, and then the return to book 5. But now under very different circumstances, we are no longer under an earthly king, we are under a divine king, as we were once before. So you might ask the question, how is it that Israel managed to survive? They managed to survive because they told their story again and again. God was protecting them. God had, in a sense, brought them full circle to himself as their king and not having an earthly king. And by having the Torah, his law, in their hearts, that's how his kingdom would come. You can see, therefore, when Jesus comes to proclaim the kingdom, that those around him thought he was talking about a reestablishment of the political kingdom as they once had before. But God's plans are far too great from this, and we know better now that in the church, the real kingdom is a profoundly spiritual reality that transforms us from within and enables us to be faithful by the grace of God, not by our own efforts. Amen.
Amen.
Questions? Yeah, press the thing, Monique, the space bar, and ask here.
Unmuted. Just wondering, how did they actually go about singing the psalms? Do they know what ways they sang them?
The actual music to them, I haven't studied it, but I'm sure you could find, obviously the pronunciation we do know because of the Masoretes in 1008 AD. The chant they used, I don't know, but you could actually find out that through probably just doing some research, seeing, how the tones of singing the Psalms and see what the rabbis would say. I often liked, when I was doing my studies in Rome, apart from reading Catholic scholars, I would like to read Jewish scholars, because it gave me a direction where their lens was pointing. And then I thought, okay, how did Christians look at that lens, reinterpret it where they had to, or go along with it when it was actually a correct lens? But yeah, in terms of tunes, that's what you're asking for, isn't it? Tunes, the melodies. Yeah, I don't know that. But I think you could find out how they would, at least some of the tones. Just put something into Google and see, tones, Jewish melodies for psalms or something like that. See what comes up. Yeah, good question though. Other questions?
Were the Jewish people, were they very much attuned to the seasons of nature? So you've spoken about spring psalms and autumn psalms. Were there also summer and winter psalms?
Yeah, I think to answer your question, yes, I'd say they were definitely attuned to the seasons because they were, agriculturalists and farmers in so many ways. In terms of the Psalms, it doesn't seem to be a category, at least from the scholarship I've read, that Psalms are designed to follow the seasons, but certainly following the major feasts. So in book 5 particularly, so you've got the 113 to 118, the leaving of Egypt. Now that took place roughly in the month of it escapes me now, but it coincides with our March, April, and that's why we have our Easter then. And that does, in terms of the calendar, which does obviously connect with the seasons, but until you go to the Southern Hemisphere, then we throw things all over the place. But, the Easter every year is always calculated from the autumn solstice for us, or the spring solstice for the Northern Hemisphere. So the sun, and then the first, so that's always the 21st and 22nd of March, and then the Sunday after the first full moon after that. And the moon cycle is 28 days, so not every month is 28 days, and then the first full Sunday after that is Easter Sunday, and that's why it's a movable feast. But it's a result of the combination of solar and lunar calendars. Yeah. But other, I don't think there are any other specific spring psalms or something like that. Yeah. Yes, Rosie.
That you mentioned about the Feast of the Tabernacle.
Yes. Feast of Tabernacles. That's, I think, sometime, I don't know the exact date where that coincided, but there's no correspondence to it in the Christian calendar. Sometimes the Feast of Booths or the Feast of Tents. It's, I think it's something around October, November, but I don't know exactly what when it lands. That's something certainly you could put into Google and say Jewish Feast of Tabernacles, and it'll tell you roughly, like Hanukkah is in December and goes towards, I think it means 14 days, something like that. But yeah, there are feasts that did not carry over into the Christian mysteries. So
that's the tabernacle that where the Torah was given to Moses, is it?
Of the tent covering the Ark of the Covenant before the temple was built, the Feast of Tabernacles. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do you think that in the Christian context they didn't take that Feast of Tabernacles on because obviously we don't have the same sort of temple as the Jewish people, and
That could well be, because the prophecy of Jesus, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. I mean, they misunderstood what he meant. He's talking about the temple of his body, but they're thinking he's talking about the physical temple. Some say, had the Jewish people at the time accepted Christ as their Messiah, perhaps the temple would be standing still. And Mass potentially could be celebrated there. But the fact is that Christ had to be sacrificed as the Lamb of God. And I think the temple had to be destroyed, not because it had to be physically destroyed, but because it was no longer going to be symbolic of the temple that God wanted to build for himself. Remember, it was always a house for God and for people to go pray in there. The new temple God wanted to build was now the temple of his body, made of living stones. So you can't have that when the focus was so powerfully set on a physical building. So my view is that even if they had have accepted Christ as the Messiah, that somehow or other the temple would have to cease existing, because it's just not the real. I mean, there would have been a massive shift in mindset there to have the people think temple in terms of the spiritual reality, when for centuries they've been focused on a physical temple. This is where you go and offer sacrifice. I mean, even in the church, where the spiritual idea of temple is very clear, but people, because we are made of flesh and blood, we need physical symbols that we actually then call temples. And we call them churches, right? But they're a temple. And initially, masses were celebrated in households. And so it was the domus ecclesia, the house of the church. Notice the church is the people who come in and pray. But then eventually that morphed over the centuries, and the building or the house began to be called church, a church. So it's, anyway, I hope that answers your question.